Hey economics students, in this video we're looking at the relationship between two key concepts which we've looked at in previous videos. One is the budget outcome, so the relationship between the budget outcome and the level of government debt, or also known as public debt. Let's get into it. Let's just recall what we're talking about with these two concepts. Remember the first thing, the budget outcome, either the budget is in deficit, so it has an underlying cash deficit, or it has an underlying cash surplus. Deficit means that they are running, revenues are less than our expenses. In other words, they're spending more than they're earning. And a surplus would be when your expenses are less. I don't know why I'm doing it the other way around this time. Your expenses are less than your revenues. So in other words, you've got some money left over. A couple of things to remember out when we're looking at the budget outcome, or the underlying cash balance. First of all, it's a flow measurement. Remember this from Unit 3, Outcome 3. A flow measurement measures changes over a period of time. In this case, we're looking at over a financial year. So we're basically measuring the difference between revenues in and expenses out over the financial year. Debt, however, public debt, the total stock of debt, is a stock measurement because we measure debt at a point in time. So again, we could use the same sort of thinking that we looked at, that we used when we were looking at Unit 3, Outcome 3. Basically, the total stock of government bonds which are outstanding. So the total stock of bonds that the government has sold. So what's the relationship? What's the relationship between this and this? And actually, maybe what's the relationship between this and this? The relationship could go both ways. Let's get into it. And I'm going to get you to do a lot of work in this video. So pause this and have a think. If we're running a deficit, let's see if we can fill out this paragraph here. A lot of this we've already done before. So if the government runs a deficit, this means, I've already said this means just the other way around. It means that their expenses are greater than their revenues over a financial year. Yes, you got that right, I'm sure. They need to finance this. Remember that keyword finance, because they have to borrow. They need to finance this by selling. Remember, the government sells this asset and in return it receives some money to finance the deficit. And this will, of course, increase the total stock of government debt. So anytime you run a deficit, it increases the level of government debt. Sorry, that doesn't make much sense. That's an increase in government debt. All right, but there's another relationship going on. I want you to pause again and see if you can work this one out. Okay, this is probably the other way around, the one that I just talked about at the start of this video, which is if the government sells bonds, they always sell bonds to finance their deficit, which is kind of what we've already talked about a lot. This would increase the total stock of government debt, which is what I just said. Now, why is this important? How does this relate back to the deficit? Because an increase in debt leads to an increase in interest repayments. Remember, if you borrow money from somebody, they expect not only their money back at the end of a period, but also some interest along the way. Interest on bonds is called coupon payments, or the interest repayments. So whenever the government sells a bond, they have to pay back interest, usually annually. That is an expense for the government, and that will show up on the expenses side of the budget. So if the government increases the level of debt, this will increase the size, or the future size, of their deficit. And the key point here is that it's ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. So a couple of relationships to think both ways. What about if the government runs a surplus? Pause and you have a think. Okay, so if the government runs a surplus, this means the opposite. It means that their revenues are greater than their expenses. So they've got some money left over, and yes, again, it's over the financial year. Remember that it's only a choice, so they may choose to use this surplus to pay, I'm going to use this term, pay down their debt. And to be really specific about it, it's paying back maturing. Remember, when a bond matures, you have to pay it back. So the Australian Office of Financial Management will work this out for the government, but they'll basically pay back some of the bonds. This would obviously decrease the total stock of government debt. So if I went too quick, go back and have a look at those, because those are the key relationships between the budget outcome and the level of government debt. I just got one more question for you, a bit of a trick here. We've got the budget outcome over a period. So we've got a couple of budget outcomes, I should say. In 2019, a $100 billion deficit. In 2020, about a $90 billion deficit. And you can see that the deficit is getting smaller over time. I want you to think, what's the impact of this trend on the level of government debt? Pause and have a think. All right, well, if any of you said that the level of government debt is decreasing, you would be wrong, because any time the government runs a deficit, doesn't matter how big or small it is, the level of, or the total stock of government debt will increase, because every time they run a deficit, they have to sell an equal amount of bonds to finance that deficit. So you would see that in the first year, the debt increased to $100 billion, then it increased to 190, and you can see the debt is increasing, albeit at a slower rate in these last 2 years. So it's still increasing. And if you're a numbers person, not a visual, you can see here that the government's outcome is equal to the level of debt, and then we just add, each period we just add the deficit to the outstanding debt, or the total stock of debt, and debt increases just by a slower rate. All right, bye for now.